I'm Tom Baker, this is Chasing Cars, and this is a Toyota RAV4, an SUV we've talked about a lot on this channel, but we've mainly focused on the hybrid model. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, and I hope you have been, you'll probably remember that we ran a long-term cruiser hybrid, which is basically the top of the range here in Australia. This vehicle is not the top of the range. In fact, it's right at the opposite end of the RAV4 lineup. This is a two-wheel drive, 2-litre petrol GX Manual. Because you may not have realized it, but they actually do offer the RAV4 in base manual specification here in Australia. It's just a tick above 30 grand, so it's a lot cheaper than buying one of the top spec hybrid models, though you can get the hybrid across the range as well. So in today's video, we're going to be working out, is it worth saving your money on a cheaper RAV4 model, or is it worth just spending a little bit more to make your way up the range? So what we're going to do is our usual thing. We'll jump inside, check out this cabin, have a look in the back, and then take the RAV4 GX Manual out on the road for a drive. But first, what's it like here in the interior? Well, there's good and bad. In the good column is the fact that most things in here are basically shared across the RAV4 range, so there's a lot to like in terms of design and functionality. The bad news is that some of the materials are downgraded quite significantly in order to get this car to the price that it is. And that starts with the plastic steering wheel and plastic manual shifter down here. Now, it's not the worst that I've felt, but it just feels a bit old school Toyota in that kind of urethane plastic way. If you step up to a GXL, which is the mid-spec car, you lose the manual option, but you get a leather steering wheel and shifter. So it's kind of about your priorities in this regard. But up here on the dash, those materials which are so soft and nice in the cruiser are all retained here in the GX, as is the technology. So we have a nice big 8-inch touchscreen here, really easy to use, reliable Bluetooth connection, fairly good maps, and wired Apple CarPlay and Android Auto through a fast charging USB port down here ahead of the shifter. But no wireless phone charging at this level where that would normally be on the higher spec cars. In front of you, you've got a set of analog gauges, but they're clear and easy to read, and there's a color digital screen between them with a digital speedo and other trip computer functions. So it all works pretty well. It all still feels very RAV4-y in here, including the firm but comfortable seats, which do give you good support, and they have a decent range of manual adjustment as well. Now, in terms of practicality, big cup holders, already mentioned this tray up here. We have another deep bin between the seats, and big door bins as well. However, in the GX and also in the GXL, those door trims are hard, which is a bit surprising for a car that starts with a 3, I reckon, but largely up front, it's pretty nice. What about in the back? Well, doors open pretty wide. Child seat points are visible, easy to find, and the amount of space back here is impressive. The RAV4 isn't too small, not too big, pretty much in between, and that means that you'll be able to fit 3 adults back here without a problem. So for myself, I'm 6 foot. As you can see, headroom's massive. There's actually quite a bit more headroom in this car than our long-term cruiser because that car has a sunroof. Legroom's good, tow room's really good. We've got air vents back here, which is really good, especially here on the base spec. Not something that you find on every base model vehicle in Australia, sadly. But this is one of the benefits of buying into a cheaper medium SUV rather than a more expensive small SUV. Because of course, for this kind of money, you could be getting a mid-spec, high-spec, compact crossover. Whereas here in the RAV4, you're kind of getting some of those engineering benefits of this more expensive car, even though we're on the most inexpensive trim. So I hope that kind of makes sense. But you can tell we're in the most expensive trim because we have those hard door trims. But we do get a flip down armrest with 2 cup holders, but only 1 map pocket over here on the passenger seat. The seat itself, reasonably comfortable. In fact, the cloth upholstery in this car doesn't feel cheap, it actually feels quite nice. And the seats recline just a little bit, but you know, makes them a touch more comfortable. So, as a family car, it's very serviceable. That theme continues round at the backside, and I actually think the RAV4 is quite an attractive car these days. I certainly think this shape pulls it off better than the previous generation, which I thought was a bit meh. Here in the GX, it is a manual tailgate. You do get an electric tailgate in the cruiser, but as you can see, there's heaps of boot space. It's a nice flat floor, so even heavy stuff just slides straight on out. Underneath that boot floor, we have a spare and a retractable cargo cover as well, though it isn't a trick one like in a CX-5, which extends even when the boot door is open, so you kind of have to manually open or close it. We do have a little storage cubby over to the right, but no shopping bag hooks. In terms of the door itself, it's not too heavy and it is assisted by gas struts, so I don't think you'll really struggle to close it, even though it doesn't have electric operation. Right, let's jump into the driver's seat of the manual 2-litre RAV4 and see what it's like on the road. So we've been pretty effusive in our praise of the RAV4 on this channel, and part of that is down to the massive improvement that this generation of Toyota's midsize SUV made in the driving dynamics department. Put simply, the old one was totally forgettable. I literally can't remember anything about what it was like to drive. So average. This one, I'm not saying it's the top of the class, I'm not saying it's more fun to drive than a Volkswagen Tiguan or a Skoda Kodiaq, but it's so much more cohesive. The ride and handling came along in leaps and bounds for this new generation of RAV4, and every model in the range gets the benefit of that. That being said, one of the best things about a long-term RAV4 was that it was the hybrid model, and so it gets the best engine, it gets by far the best fuel economy, so I'm interested in how many of those benefits carry across to the standard 2-litre petrol. Because what we have here is still a new engine, Toyota's Dynamic Force 2-litre 4-cylinder naturally aspirated petrol. In this application it makes 127 kilowatts of power and 203 newton meters of torque, so competitive on the power front, but not a huge amount of torque. In the Corolla, it's okay. Here in the RAV4, you're not going anywhere fast. That being said, nor is it so insanely sluggish that you couldn't consider it. It's fine, and at least in this car you have the benefit of the manual, so you can kind of roll it along and keep it towards that torque band if you really do need to drive this car fast. Speaking of the manual, it's a standard transmission on the RAV4 at this end of the range. It's about $30,990. The CVT automatic is a $2,000 impost here on the base model, and that compares to the fact that if you're in the auto, it's another $2,500 then to step up to the hybrid. So a hybrid is $4,500 more than this base manual. So if you're on a budget but you want a new RAV4, this is obviously a model you're going to have to consider. The good news is it doesn't feel like a budget car apart from this plastic steering wheel. Everything else about it feels remarkably grown up and actually quite refined. The first thing in that vein is the really nice ride quality. Only kind of recurring juddering potholes really harm the sort of serenity here in the cabin. Everything else about the ride is really level, the body control is decent, and it's just a really comfy car. It's certainly biased towards comfort. You wouldn't accuse the new RAV4 of being sporty, but you just kind of forget about it and enjoy the well-damped suspension, just the well-tuned approach that Toyota took to this car. But then, when you find a good stretch of road, it actually can turn on a little bit of good handling as well, because the steering is surprisingly nice. Just like we found in our hybrid long-termer, turn-in is quite crisp, the car moves around with some sense of agility, and while there is some body roll, you just know where the car is. The limits of grip are fairly high, actually, for a Toyota RAV4, I would have said, and it's almost kind of engaging to start punting a little bit more deliberately. But once again, this is a comfortable SUV rather than an overtly sporty one, but it can turn it on kind of when you want it to. Now, it's fairly quiet apart from when you're revving that 2-litre engine all the way out, but most of the time you won't need to be doing that, and it doesn't create much of a din. The stock stereo is also decent enough, so you can just crank up your music regardless. But one thing that's quite impressive is that even in this base model RAV4, it still has a decent smattering of safety features. Stuff like adaptive cruise control is standard, AEB as well, and active lane keep assist. The main things that you're missing out on this spec are blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, but it does have a big, crisp reversing camera, and the glass house on this car is really good. It's quite boxy, the windows are big, so visibility isn't a problem. So would I buy it? Would I consider it? Yeah, if I wanted to spend like 30 grand on a new RAV4, I certainly would. I don't mind the manual. It's got even stuff like rev match downshifts that make it easier to drive, but it does use a lot more fuel than the hybrid. So over my week with this car, mixed driving used about 9 litres per 100, whereas in the hybrid, you could easily get that to 5 to 6 litres per 100k. So that hybrid upgrade if you're coming from the CVT option, is going to pay for itself fairly quickly. But if spending as little money on a new RAV4 as possible is the goal, the manual actually acquits itself pretty well. So those are our detailed impressions of the Toyota RAV4 Manual. So the burning question, should you save your money and get something like this GX 6-speed instead of one of the more expensive versions of this car up the range? Well, it all really depends on how much money you've got to spend. Here at the bottom of the range, you're still buying into good quality engineering and those good driving dynamics that come on every RAV4. But for me, this car is most special with the hybrid powertrain, which not only saves you a ton of fuel, but also makes it even better to drive again. But you can let me know all your thoughts down below the video. While you're there, make sure to hit subscribe and the notification bell. Help us out on our way to 100K. It makes a big difference. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.